When you hear the words the 1950s, you probably picture something simple. Neat little houses with white picket fences, dads in fedoras, moms in aprons, and kids riding bikes until the streetlights came on. TV reruns and advertisements told us it was the golden decade of tradition, a time when families were perfect, neighbors were friendly, and life seemed so much easier than it does today. But here's the truth. The 1950s were not as traditional as we were told. Behind the glossy magazine covers, America was quietly reshaping itself. Women were restless. Teenagers were rebelling. Minorities were fighting for their rights. And the shadow of the Cold War loomed over every dinner table. So today, let's go back in time. Not to the picture-perfect postcard version of the 1950s, but to the real 1950s. The one full of contradictions, quiet struggles, and a restless energy that was preparing the world for the revolutions just around the corner. Section 1. The Myth of the Perfect Family. The 1950s sold America a dream, the nuclear family. Dad went to work, Mom stayed home. The kids behaved. Dinner was on the table at 6. Television shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver painted the picture of family life that every American household was supposed to strive for. But here's the hidden truth. Fewer than 10% of families in the 1950s actually looked like that. Most didn't have the shiny car in the driveway, the manicured lawn, or the perfectly happy housewife. Imagine being a woman who worked in a factory during World War II, welding, riveting, proving your strength. Then the war ends, and suddenly society tells you to go home, put on an apron, and find happiness only in scrubbing floors and raising kids. Many women felt trapped. Diaries from the time are full of frustration. Is this really all I'm meant to be? And men weren't immune either. Veterans came home carrying scars no one talked about. PTSD wasn't understood, and many silently struggled. They carried the pressure of being the sole provider, of holding their families together while often feeling broken inside. The picture of tradition was beautiful on the outside, but behind closed doors? Families were complicated, just like they are today. Section 2. The economic boom and hidden inequality. Yes, the economy boomed. The 1950s saw new highways, shiny new suburbs, and rows of freshly built houses filled with new appliances. The GI Bill gave returning soldiers loans to buy homes, and for many, it was the first time their families ever owned property. But that prosperity wasn't shared equally. While white families moved into brand-new Levittown homes with low-interest loans, many African-American veterans were denied those same opportunities. Segregation and discrimination locked them out of the American dream. Picture this. You fight overseas for your country, risk your life, and come home expecting a fresh start. Then the bank tells you no, not because you lack money, but because of the color of your skin. That was the reality for thousands. Latino workers, Native Americans, and immigrants faced the same barriers. So when we call the 1950s a decade of prosperity, we have to ask, prosperity for who? The truth is, the traditional 1950s belonged mostly to a narrow slice of America. And for everyone else, it was a time of being left behind. Section 3. Teen culture and rebellion. If the 1950s were traditional, how do you explain the explosion of youth culture? For the first time in history, teenagers weren't just kids waiting to grow up. They became their own market, their own identity. With after-school jobs, allowances, and more free time, teens suddenly had spending power. And they used it. Rock and roll exploded. Elvis Presley hit the stage, shaking his hips in a way parents called scandalous, but kids couldn't get enough of. James Dean smirked from the big screen, embodying teenage rebellion in Rebel Without a Cause. Drive-in theaters filled with cars full of kids eating popcorn, drinking sodas, and holding hands under the stars. Soda fountains and jukeboxes became the new hangouts. Hot rods and leather jackets symbolized independence. Parents panicked. Preachers warned that rock and roll would rot the morals of the youth. But the genie was out of the bottle. Teenagers were rewriting what it meant to grow up. Tradition said they should obey their parents. The 1950s said, "We want our own voice." That rebellion was the heartbeat of the decade, and the reason the 1960s would explode with even bigger cultural shifts. Section 4, Gender Roles and Silent Struggles. For women, the 1950s were a paradox. On TV, you saw June Cleaver smiling in her pearls. But in real life, many women were deeply unhappy. Magazines printed endless advice. How to please your husband. Why keeping a clean home shows your love. Cooking tips to keep him happy. But what about women's happiness? That wasn't part of the conversation. Some women began to question quietly. Betty Friedan, who would later write The Feminine Mystique, called it the problem that has no name, the emptiness so many housewives felt. This wasn't tradition. This was pressure, expectation, and often loneliness. And beyond gender roles, other groups lived in silence. The LGBTQ+ community existed, of course it did, but society refused to acknowledge them. Gay men and women lived double lives, some even marrying just to hide who they were. Bars and underground spaces became secret sanctuaries. Tradition tried to erase them, but they were there, living, breathing, waiting for the day they could exist openly. Section 5, Technology and Everyday Life. When you think about the 1950s, you might imagine black and white TV sets flickering in living rooms, and it's true. Television became the new hearth of the home. Families gathered to watch shows together, from comedy to westerns to the evening news. The microwave oven was introduced. TV dinners arrived in little foil trays promising convenience. Kitchens gleamed with new appliances, toasters, mixers, shiny refrigerators. Ads told families these gadgets would give them more free time. But did they? Or did they just raise the standard for what a good home should look like? Women, in particular, found themselves working harder to live up to these new expectations of spotless kitchens and perfectly cooked meals. Technology made life look modern, but it also made tradition more demanding. Section 6, Politics, Fear, and the Cold War. If the 1950s were traditional, they were also terrified. Children practiced duck and cover drills in school, hiding under desks as if wood could protect them from nuclear bombs. Families built fallout shelters in their basements, stocking them with canned goods in case the unthinkable happened. At the same time, Senator Joseph McCarthy stoked fear of communism. People were accused of being un-American for something as small as attending the wrong meeting years earlier. Careers were ruined. Friendships ended. Neighbors turned suspicious of each other. Was this tradition? Or was it fear dressed up as patriotism? The truth is, The Cold War made the 1950s a decade of constant anxiety. Behind the smiling TV families, Americans lived with the quiet terror that tomorrow might never come. Section 7. The Seeds of Change. And then came the whispers of change. In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education struck down school segregation. A year later, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery. The civil rights movement had begun, and tradition would never look the same again. Young people were restless. Women were discontent. Minorities were fighting back. And all of it was setting the stage for the 1960s, a decade that would tear down whatever illusions of tradition the 1950s tried to maintain. So, were the 1950s traditional? On the surface, maybe. But underneath, they were a powder keg of quiet rebellion, inequality, fear, and hope. If you've ever looked back at the 1950s and thought, those were the good old days, maybe now you see the other side. It wasn't all milkshakes and drive-ins. It was families struggling, communities excluded, and people quietly rewriting the future. Tell me in the comments. When you think of the 1950s, what's the first image that comes to your mind? I'd love to hear your stories. And if you enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe, because in the next video, we'll step into another forgotten corner of history, and I promise it'll change the way you see the past.